Okay, let's get right into it. For decades, a ghost haunted the state of California. A single predator who moved through the shadows, wore so many different masks, and left a trail of absolute terror that completely baffled investigators for more than 40 years. Today, we're unmasking him. And that's not an exaggeration at all. This wasn't a story that lasted a few months or even a few years. We're talking about an entire generation that lived under the threat of an attacker who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere all at once. The fear was absolutely real, and the mystery of who he was total. To really wrap your head around the sheer scale of his terror, just look at this. Between 1974 and 1986, this one man was responsible for at least 13 murders, over 50 rapes, and more than 120 burglaries. When you see these numbers laid out, it's clear this wasn't just a criminal. This was a one-man crime wave that stretched across the entire state.
Now here's what's so wild. For the longest time, law enforcement didn't even realize they were hunting a single person. The crimes were so different and they were so spread out geographically that it just seemed like the work of several different offenders.
He basically collected names like he collected victims. Down in the Central Valley, he was the Visalia ransacker. Then he moves north to Sacramento, and he becomes the infamous East Area rapist. Then, in Southern California, he's the original Night Stalker. It was only much, much later that these separate, terrifying identities were all stitched together under one final name: the Golden State Killer.
And his crimes, well, they weren't static. He evolved, becoming more and more violent, more depraved over time. He was learning, adapting, and without a doubt, getting bolder. Seeing his progression laid out like this is just chilling. He starts in the mid-70s as the Visalia ransacker, mostly a burglar, but that's when he committed his first murder. By 76, he's in the Sacramento area, escalating to serial rape. And then, from 79 to 86, he escalates again, becoming a full-blown serial murderer down in Southern California. Each phase was its own distinct chapter of horror. This quote, "This really gets to the heart of his psychological cruelty. As the East Area rapist, he'd break into homes, tie up couples, and then, in this truly sadistic move, he'd stack plates or teacups on the man's back. He'd whisper this to them, turning the victims into unwilling triggers for their own tragedy. The silence had to be absolute." All right, now for the twists that nobody, and I mean nobody, saw coming. The reason he was so good at evading capture, the reason he always seemed to know what the police would do next, was because he was one of them. Can you just imagine the paralysis in these communities? People were setting up neighborhood patrols, buying guns, sleeping with all the lights on. But no matter what they did, this guy would just slip through the net. He seemed to have this almost supernatural ability to anticipate law enforcement's every move. And the reason he was so elusive is just shocking. The predator, Joseph James D'Angelo, was a police officer himself in both Exeter and Auburn during the early part of his crime spree. This gave him an insider's understanding of police procedures, investigation techniques, everything. He wasn't just breaking the law, he was using his knowledge of it to stay free. And then, in 1986, just as suddenly as it all began, it stopped. The attacks just ceased. The killer vanished into thin air. For over 30 years, the trail went completely cold, leaving hundreds of victims and their families with no answers. So where was this monster? Hiding in plain sight, living this shockingly mundane suburban life. He was married, he had kids, he worked as a mechanic. To his neighbors, he was just a grumpy old man who was weirdly obsessed with his lawn. It's the most chilling reality. One of the most prolific serial predators in American history was disguised as a totally unremarkable neighbor. For 3 decades, he got away with it. But then, in 2018, science finally came up with a way to hunt a ghost. This was the turning point. The case that had been frozen in time for so long was about to be blown wide open by a revolutionary new technique. And this is it: genetic genealogy. The concept is just brilliant in its simplicity. You see, investigators take the killer's DNA from a crime scene and upload it to public genealogy databases.
They're not looking for the killer himself, but for his relatives. By finding, say, a third cousin or a great aunt, they can start to build a family tree that leads right back to the suspect. So once they found a few distant relatives, it became this massive game of connect the dots. They built these sprawling family trees going back generations, looking for where all the branches intersected. Slowly but surely, they started eliminating possibilities until only one name was left. A man who fit the age, the location, the profile, Joseph James DeAngelo. After 44 years, the phantom finally had a face. And when police arrested the 72-year-old man outside his own home, his response wasn't a confession. It wasn't a denial. It was this bizarre, mundane statement of a suburban grandpa. I have a roast in the oven. The disconnect is just staggering. With DeAngelo finally in custody, the final chapter could begin. Decades of questions would finally get answered, and the man behind the mask would be forced to confront his crimes. In court, there wasn't some dramatic trial. He pleaded guilty. When the judge asked him to confirm his responsibility for all those years of terror, his confession was as simple as it was chilling. In this frail little voice, he just said, I did all those things. No remorse, no emotion, just a flat admission. The legal conclusion was absolute. Joseph DeAngelo was sentenced to multiple life sentences without any chance of ever getting parole. He would die in prison. It was a guarantee that the monster who haunted California for so long would never, ever be free again. So, what's the big takeaway here? Well, first, a measure of justice, finally, for the hundreds of people he terrorized. But beyond that, this case forever changed criminal investigation. The use of genetic genealogy was a watershed moment. It created this powerful new tool that has since been used to solve dozens and dozens of other cold cases, bringing other ghosts out of the shadow. And that brings us to the final, unsettling question. The Golden State Killer wasn't some creature from a horror movie. He was a father, a neighbor, a cop. His story really forces us to wonder, how many others are out there living ordinary lives with monstrous secrets hidden just beneath the surface?